was him who told me about, you're a veteran now, Claude. And I'm like, what? How can I be a veteran? I didn't do 20 years. But you're a veteran because of what they did. And I didn't know it until he told me. And then I had to start applying and speaking to people at Veterans Affairs. And that wasn't easy either. Oh my God.
When did you apply to be considered a veteran?
2017 or 18.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, not very long ago.
The road to justice for LGBT Purge survivors was not an easy one, even after the Government of Canada's apology. As you'll hear in the 8th and final episode of Queer Legends series that tells the truth of Canada's LGBT Purge, the apology was a new beginning. I'm your host, Sean Dern.
And later that night, we had, there was a reception held by the Chief of Defense Staff at the Armories in Ottawa, at the Cartier Armories, and that was really a wonderful moment as well, because there were serving members of the RCMP and armed forces there. Chief of Defense Staff apologized. There was a private reception for Purge survivors with the Prime Minister. But to see the Purge survivors hanging out with with the current serving people, you could see how meaningful that was to them and how meaningful the apology from the Chief of Defense Staff was. It was really fantastic, and if I had scripted the day, I couldn't have done better, truly. So that was marvelous. But then, of course, that was a framework. We still had many meetings after that where we had to hammer out the terms of the settlement agreement. That turned out to be very complicated, as witnessed by the fact that we had to do, we're now into our 4th supplementary agreement. And then we had to get court approval. And the court approval was in June of 2018. And that was really something special.
Class action lawsuits are often settled in judges' chambers, but lead counsel Dr. Douglas Elliott had other plans. He asked Justice Martine Saint-Louis to hold the settlement hearing in open court, with everyone in their legal gowns in the most beautiful federal courtroom in Ottawa, located in the Supreme Court of Canada building. Justice Saint-Louis agreed, and she agreed to hear from Purge survivors.
And they all stood up, one after another, and told their stories. And Justice Saint-Louis, bless her heart, she sat there and listened patiently to all of them. And at the end, she said, I approve the settlement. And it took a second. The people in the courtroom, they sort of were stunned. And then they looked at each other. Is it true? And then they erupted in applause and hugs and jumping up and down. It was quite the scene.
Afterwards, court officials told Doug Elliott that they had never had a day like that in the federal court in all the years that they'd worked there.
It's turned out to be an absolutely wonderful settlement that everyone is really happy about. And it has so many different facets to it.
The settlement provided up to $145 million. That's $110 million for individual compensation, where survivors got between $5,000 and $50,000 based on their level of hurt. There was $15 million in legal fees, $5 million for external administration, and $15 million for recognition and memorialization projects like this podcast series and monuments administered by the LGBT Purge Fund, which was also created out of the settlement. Individual reconciliation measures included a personal apology letter, access to members' personnel records, and a notation to file, as well as the Canada Pride Citation,
which is a kind of medal that Purge survivors get to wear. And what these people really needed was a kind of gay Purple Heart. You know, they have the Purple Heart in the United States that goes to people who are injured in the course of their duties, however they get injured. And I thought these people deserve a medal for being injured in service to their country, because I knew from dealing with them that the vast majority of them had PTSD or other severe psychological scars.
You know, class actions are imperfect vehicles, so you try your best, but you can't give someone back the life they would have had if this hadn't happened to them. it's the best thing that we have in order to try to, do justice on that broad of a scale. But it's imperfect. So it'll never be giving back someone the life that they deserve to have.
You have to remember these people, a lot of them, some of them were like John Watkins, who was in the end of his career. But most of the people who were injured were very young, especially the ones in the Canadian Armed Forces. They were 18, 19, 20 years old. The most brutal coming out process that you can possibly imagine. So I feel that they deserved a medal because they were injured in service to our country. And they love that medal.
Based on my interviews with dozens of LGBT Purge survivors, I can confirm that the Canada Pride citation is in fact loved by recipients. Unfortunately, the Canadian Armed Forces is known for being less than enthusiastic about presenting the new medals in some cases. Here's retired Major John McDougall.
They sent out forms asking where we wanted it presented. Did we want it mailed to us, or did we want it presented in Ottawa? And I'm like, I want Ottawa. I want somebody who was serving in the military at the same time I was to present it, so that they have the ability to reflect back on what their mindset was at that time versus their mindset now as they present me this citation. And then along came everybody's favorite friend, COVID, and everything got put on hold. They sent me a message saying, we apologize for the delay, but in the interest of ensuring you're recognized, we will mail your citation to you, but you'll get it presented at a later date. So they mailed my presentation, or my citation, and it came by Canada Post, and it came in a cardboard box that was set on my front deck in the rain. So my Pride citation arrived in a soggy, wet cardboard box.
They couldn't even bother to do that registered mail.
Today, I wear it on my uniform and I wear it on my lapel. It has yet to be presented. I have sent emails after emails. The last email I sent was a reply in February.
I recorded this interview with John in mid-December 2022, 10 months after his emailed response to the military, which was about how they wanted to present John's citation to him in a small COVID-safe environment in Edmonton.
And I wrote this very, very long email talking about their draconian measures and how they're making me feel excluded like you did all those years ago. And if it's safe to do it in a small COVID-friendly environment in Edmonton, why is it not available to be done in Ottawa in a small COVID-friendly environment? I sent that email in February. I never had a response. I talked to a couple people about it, and they said, well, what would you think if we presented it to you tomorrow? I said, had you presented it to me in 2019, 2020, I would have told you about the previous 30 years. You present it to me tomorrow and I'll tell you about the last 5 years.
Despite some of these ongoing indignities, one of the most important outcomes, or perhaps revelations, of the entire LGBT Purge negotiation and settlement process was that Purge survivors were considered to be military veterans.
And I said, well, my clients were told, you're not a veteran, get out, never darken our door, don't bother applying for veterans benefits, you've been kicked out. And they said, well, they may have been told that, but legally that's not the case. They were not considered to be dishonorably discharged. They are considered to be veterans, and they are considered to be eligible. When I told Todd Ross that, he wouldn't believe me. He wouldn't believe me because he had been told in no uncertain terms that he was not a veteran. So that was a big aha moment for me that, oh, wow, all of these people are veterans and entitled to veterans benefits. That's huge. If we achieve nothing else, that's going to be gigantic for these people, both psychologically and practically, because of the wide range of benefits that are available to veterans.
People were popping up all over the place. And people were really, 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 really hurt and really vulnerable. So we discovered...
These are survivors you're talking about, okay.
Yeah. So when we were doing the negotiation with Seamus O'Ryan, that was the Minister of Veteran Affairs at that point, we made sure there was a Department of Veteran Affairs that was 2S LGBTQ, and that if people were putting demand to get veteran affairs from people that were purged, that it was going to be accepted, and that they were going to get the psychological help while we negotiate. Because it looks stupid, but some people didn't talk about it all their life. And suddenly this is coming out.
I didn't even know that the government or the military was out there to help us after we were kicked out. It was one of my friends from ex-military friends that told me about it. And he had a rough time because he lost his partner to AIDS, but they kicked both him and his partner out. His partner was ex-officer. It was him who told me about, you're a veteran now, Claude. And I'm like, what? How can I be a veteran? I didn't do 20 years. But you're a veteran because of what they did. And I didn't know it until he told me. And then I had to start applying and speaking to people at Veterans Affairs. And that wasn't easy either. Oh my God. Sometimes I felt like the people that I speak, particularly one woman, she actually said she said I was lying, like all of the stuff that I had gone through. Yeah, I know, and everybody said they're supposed to be there to help you, but then there's certain ones that just, I guess they're trying to prove all of the information you're telling them is correct. And the concept, okay, well, how come it took you this long to come forward? Well, because at the time I didn't think, where was I going to go? Who was I going to talk to? You know, I'm not about to go to my supervisor in the military and tell him what happened to me.
When did you apply to be considered a veteran?
2017 or 18.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, not very long ago.
That's a long time between.
Mm-hmm.
So you hadn't thought about the fact that you are a veteran?
When I went to Veterans Affairs, I needed to speak with my doctor. I'd see a psychiatrist that they gave me to go to. I needed to go through my therapist. So all of this stuff was like they were bringing more of it out of me than, because I held it in. After a while, I even forgot about it. Like I kind of let it go because I went on with life. And this is where I was considered to have the PTSD because it came back, and it came back hard. Now I'm slowly, I've been in therapy with my therapist since then. And
this is something, sorry, go ahead. Didn't
and
interrupt.
also talking with my friends, the ex-military friends, which I've all found them, because I actually thought one of them had passed away, but he was alive, living in Merritt, BC, with his partner. But like I told you, their stories are a lot worse. What happened to the people in the early times was worse. Like the electric shock treatment, it's like that woman in one of them where she said she was taken to a shack. That's what I felt like was being done to me when they took me to the military base, because I didn't know where they were taking me. I had no idea. So at this point, I'm just kind of living my life, or trying to. But the military's been taking care of me ever since.
They have?
Yeah.
Would you say they've been doing an okay job?
Yes. Well, for me, for my part, I didn't ask a lot from them. I just wanted what everybody else was supposed to get.
Even after hearing the beautiful words, I was pretty skeptical up until somebody convinced me to connect with Veterans Affairs and start to get some benefits with them. Because I was scared shitless. I was scared shitless of not being believed. I was scared shitless of experiencing the same shit again. And it's an ongoing fear, right? I continue to have interactions with Veterans Affairs, but there's always that fear that somebody's going to turn around and say, You're just a fucking fraud.
Reaching out to Veterans Affairs, the fear of not being believed that went along with it, and simply filing the claim to join the class action suit was traumatizing. It forced hundreds of survivors to confront and relive some of the most horrific and violent experiences of their once young lives.
As part of the class action suit, we had to obviously fill out paperwork, and while they were very gracious in their communications and in the paperwork, they even included a phone number, so if this is triggering to fill this out, that you have someone to call. I think I filled the paperwork out 4 different times. I crumpled it up and tossed it and cried and was miserable and moody, and my husband hid upstairs a lot. It was a really difficult journey to figure that out. And again, I like to think I'm a pretty strong person. The difficulties I had filling that out makes me wonder how many other people did not have the strength to fill that out, how many were intimidated by the form, that they didn't have the help they needed to fill it out so they could get recognized. When I finally sent it in and was acknowledged, again, it was a little empty. It was nice to know that I was acknowledged, and it validated, I guess, everything that I had been living through and telling people. It's like, okay, yeah, this isn't just a poor John thing. This is actually legitimately recognized.
Another result of the settlement was the creation of the LGBT Purge Fund, which exists to share the stories of survivors and to commemorate the LGBT Purge. Among the Purge Fund's biggest and most important projects is the identification, collection, and sharing of historical government, military, and RCMP documents related to Canada's anti-queer campaign. In Gary Kinsman's new 3rd edition of The Regulation of Desire, he states, quote, "There is a major problem regarding remembering the Purge campaign," unquote. So I asked Gary to explain what he meant by that.
That was especially in the context of the release of documents, and I do have to give some credit to the LGBT Purge Fund, that they actually have got more documents released than ever before. And it's really good that Sven Robinson has actually been able to do some of this work.
After sitting on the Prime Minister's special committee to develop the government's apology, former MP Sven Robinson was hired as a consultant by the LGBT Purge Fund to lead its historical documents project.
And through legal threats, they've actually got more documents released.
I have to say it's been incredibly frustrating to deal with the Department of Justice in this process. They have blocked us every step of the way, to the point that we actually had to go to the federal court to try to get an order from the federal court for them to respect the terms of Schedule L, which was the provision that was included in the class action for access to documents.
The documents process was horrible. I was criticized by Professor Kinsman for not having a more detailed and robust documents process built into the settlement agreement. But I will tell you with no fear of contradiction by anyone who's been involved in the documents process, that had we tried to hammer out the details, it would have held up the entire settlement for years. And people would not have got their money and their Canada Pride citations and so on.
But the government has, and this was clear in the actual first terms of settlement of the class action suit, the government made no commitment to release all of the organizing text. I'm not talking about all of the individual documents on people who were purged. Obviously, there's reasons why we don't want those publicly released.
Why was it so difficult? Well, the main reason is that the access to information process in our country is broken.
They claimed over 1,500 pages of documents were subjected to solicitor-client privilege. This is absolutely outrageous because, of course, these documents are documents that tell the story. And they're documents that date back to the 80s and 40, 50 years old and older. And to deny us access to these documents on the basis of an exemption in the Access to Information Act that, in my view, just doesn't apply.
So is it fair to say then that the Trudeau government made a commitment to hand over all of the documents related to the purge, but then has failed to do so?
Absolutely. No question about it. In order to tell the full story of the purge, we need access to the debates that took place, the political debates that took place. We need access to what was the advice that senior people were giving the government to defend these policies that they accepted. I mean, Perrin Beatty got legal advice, obviously, from the lawyers. It's called the Judge Advocate General.
So Perrin Beatty is an interesting politician. At the time of this episode's release, Beatty is wrapping up his tenure as the president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. He's also the former head of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and he was defense minister in Brian Mulroney's government during a critical period of the purge. I contacted the Canadian Chamber of Commerce by phone and email in late June 2023 asking for an interview with Mr. Beatty for this documentary. That started a painful 6 months long back and forth with Perrin Beatty's assistant that finally led to a confirmed interview scheduled for December 5th, 2023. Then on December 1st, Beatty's assistant canceled my interview. A subsequent email read, quote, "Unfortunately, he can't commit to doing an on-the-record interview without first learning more about your initiative so he could decide whether he can contribute meaningfully to it or not," unquote. After 6 months of emails and calls about this documentary, including an extensive briefing note with all the details he could possibly want about this project, why cancel a confirmed interview? Naturally, this only made me more curious. I made some phone calls and dug a little bit deeper into my notes and the massive trove of documents on the LGBT Purge website, and maybe, just maybe, Perrin Beatty had a recollection he didn't want to share. In the dying days of his time as defense minister, Perrin Beatty approved the draft Canadian Forces Administrative Order on Sexual Orientation that I told you about in episode 6 of this series about the 1990s. You'll recall that the order was designed to, quote, "expel or exclude any homosexuals who have conducted themselves on the basis of their sexual orientation," unquote. Perrin Beatty tried to rush its approval, but couldn't get his homophobic order past Justice Canada lawyers or the PMO. The effort continued under his successor, Bill McKnight, who also failed.
Any document that comes from the Judge Advocate General to the minister, we've been denied access to. And that's wrong.
The Access to Information Act we consider it sort of a symbol of a democratic process where, as ordinary citizens, are supposed to have access to whatever information is created by the government. But it's actually the opposite in many ways.
You remember Patrizia Gentili, Carleton University professor and co-author with Gary Kinsman of the Canadian War on Queers.
The Access to Information Act protects and allows the government to decide what we're going to see and what we're not going to see. I remember going to one national defense, and they would not give me access to a bunch of documents. And then I would go to the public works department, and they would give me the exact same documents I asked in one place, and they just give it to me unredacted, right? So just for your listeners, when something's redacted, it's blackened out.
And there are plenty of documents that remain redacted to this day. We're talking 1950s, 1960s era security panel minutes, briefing notes, RCMP and military memos, and so on. It's not just the names of confirmed homosexuals and RCMP informants that were blacked out. Some of them have got page after page of big grayish squares that hide all of the information. There's not enough time for me to get into them all, but I was able to decode or find details on a few. A House of Commons security detail member seems to have had hookups with a member of Parliament and a senior civil servant or two, and he also turned over a list of 33 known or suspected homosexuals in Ottawa to the RCMP. Then there's the senior vice president of the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation and a resident of Hull, Quebec, who was arrested in a Vancouver motel room with a 21-year-old entertainer from Montreal who was dressed as a woman. Both were charged with gross indecency. And for some reason, External Affairs had a revolving door of homosexuals working at Canada's embassy in Moscow during the 1950s and 60s, each becoming targets of the same group of homosexual Soviet agents.
So when the government says they're going to give you documents, they're writing you a check that you can't cash. because there's no money in the bank.
The other challenge that the Historical Documents Project faced was a revolving door of mediocre Justice Canada employees on the file, which really slowed things down.
The silver lining of this whole thing was that the LGBT Purge Fund had responsibility for implementing this settlement agreement, and they had the money to be able to take the government to court again and to enforce this documents process. And eventually we got a new settlement, that's the fourth settlement agreement, between the Purge Fund and the Department of Justice that provided a more robust, properly resourced document recovery project that's being overseen by something called a progress committee that I'm on.
The LGBT Purge Fund reached its agreement with the government in 2023. Dr. Elliott wouldn't get into details of his committee's work, but he did say that the project is going beautifully now, finally. By the time this new documents phase is complete in 2025, as many as 15,000 more pages of LGBT Purge documents could be available to review. Personally, I hope that includes more 1960s-era documents to fill in gaps about the human research experiments known as the Fruit Machine, and its links to the psychology department at Carleton University. Now on that, I asked Patrizia Gentili what Carleton University has done, if anything, to acknowledge its role in the creation of the government's human research experiment on homosexuals.
Nothing. So there was a group of students who approached me, and we, at the time, the president of it was not the president who is currently at Carleton. We approached the president at the time to ask for an apology. I have sort of still documents from that time. So it is ignored. Nothing happened.
A spring 2016 article on Extra Magazine's website reported on the students' push for an apology. When Daily Extra asked Carleton University about Wake and his work with the RCMP, Carleton Media Relations Officer Chris Klein provided an official statement from the university. Quote, "In the absence of Carleton documents confirming Wake's engagement in this research, the university has filed an information request with the federal government to determine if there are documents to share." Unquote.
The psychology department has never really acknowledged it either. So nothing has happened.
Should they be?
Should they be? I'm going to say yes, because I think accountability is really important. I don't want them just to say, we're sorry, and then nothing happens. That's what I'm afraid of, Sean.
According to Extra, a message from then Carleton President Roseanne Runt was posted to the university website. It acknowledged that the university's history included discrimination towards Indigenous people, the unequal treatment of women, and, quote, prejudice against homosexual, gay, lesbian, bi, and transsexual persons. If members of the Carleton University community in the past promoted any sort of prejudice, I sincerely regret this, unquote. The 2016 statement also said that Carleton is not responsible for activities done outside the purview of the contracts of employment. That last bit is part of Carleton University's long-standing weasel word talking point that wrongfully suggests Dr. Frank Wake did his awful experiments while on sabbatical, so Carleton is somehow innocent of any wrongdoing. Thankfully, the government documents I reviewed for this series tell the truth of Canada's LGBT purge. That includes minutes of a special meeting of a quorum of the security panel that was held on the 24th of June 1960, where, quote, an interim report on this problem was prepared by Dr. F.R. Wake of Carleton University, unquote, for discussion by the panel. That's proof that Carleton's psychology department was working with the government before Dr. Wake's sabbatical. So too is the fact that the so-called Fruit Machine project lasted about 7 years. I very much doubt that Carleton University offered magical sabbaticals of that length in the 1960s.
So it's like, if it's an apology where they just get to say an apology like all the other institutions, like everyone is saying giving apologies, but where's the accountability piece?
And where's the change?
Where's the change? Like how is this going to open up a conversation about research ethics? Right, to me, that's accountability.
Carleton University is the only public institution in Canada that still refuses to admit or even acknowledge its dubious role in Canada's LGBT purge. It was with hope for accountability and maybe even some closure for purge survivors that I requested a short interview with Dr. Jerry Tomberlin in February 2024. Mr. Tomberlin is Carleton's interim president and vice chancellor. More than a week after my request, I received this 2-line email from Mr. Tony Frost, Carleton University's chief communications officer. Quote, Carleton is a champion of inclusivity, equity, and diversity, and is both committed to and proud of its safe campus environment, where discrimination, harassment, and sexual violence are not tolerated, unquote. That had nothing to do with my request about Carleton University's former head of psychology, Dr. Frank Wake. Tony Frost's email continued with, quote, We do thank you for your outreach. However, the university is unable to provide any further comment on this shameful, well-documented period in Canadian history, unquote. This line from Carleton University is both unhelpful and demonstrably untrue. The purge is not well documented at all, as evidenced by Carleton's own 2016 Access to Information request to the federal government for fruit machine-related documents. Additionally, Sven Robinson and I are among the first Canadians to review the government's newly released purge-era documents in any real detail.
So if the president, if we just like say to the president, please say sorry, he says sorry, great. And then there's no conversation about how research, the ethics of researching marginalized communities doesn't take place, then I'm not sure the apology is worth it.
2 follow-up emails to Carleton's chief communications officer with questions like why Carleton was unable to provide further comment or what fruit machine documents did Carleton receive from the government went unacknowledged and unanswered. Tony Frost and I were also connected on LinkedIn, but when I reached out there with my follow-up questions, Tony blocked me. Multiple calls and emails to Carleton's history department, provost's office, and the university archives all were ignored, and Carleton University's cone of silence continues. So it's a safe bet that Patrizia and LGBT Purge survivors won't get any apology from Carleton University anytime soon. Thankfully, not all communications people in Ottawa are like Tony.
Tom?
Hi, is that Emily?
This is Fee. How are you?
I'm very well. Am I catching you at a bad time?
No, not at all.
This is Emily Rose Bro. She is part of Rideau Hall's communications team. I bet you're wondering why I contacted the Governor General's office about the LGBT Purge. So was Emily. During my research, something didn't add up about former Canadian diplomat John Wendell Holmes. I mentioned him to you in episode 2 of this series. Holmes admitted to being homosexual and was asked to resign from his position as Assistant Undersecretary of State for External Affairs in the spring of 1960 for being a security risk. Then, 9 years later, the same John Wendell Holmes received the Order of Canada from the Governor General. That was also the exact same day that Pierre Trudeau's Bill C-150 received royal assent, which relaxed punishment for consensual homosexual acts between consenting adults. That was too many coincidences for me. How does a guy go from being fired for being a security risk to receiving Canada's highest honor from the head of state? At the very least, this is historically interesting, and I wanted to know who nominated Holmes for the Order of Canada.
Since the last time we've talked, what we did is we pulled the file. We don't hold that information. It's not necessarily readily available to me, anyone in the office. Especially because it's so long ago, we pulled his file. What I will say is, in pulling the file, nominations are considered confidential. But we did go through everything in the file to see if there was anything that maybe we could share that we weren't sure about. I will say it's
what have we discovered that you can let me know about?
At the time of his appointment, the only thing that was published is that one line, the position or the title. And that was, for everyone at that time, that was considered standard practice. So what you might see when we announce Order of Canada today, there'll be a longer explanation. At that time, that we didn't publish anything like that.
Yeah, it was just like, here's your short little blurb, and here's your thing, and stand, get a photo with the Governor General, and off you go.
I will say, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but there's no longer information about the reason for his appointment in the file. We don't
so you don't even have background as to who submitted this guy's name or how he got this?
What we have was a description of, and it read more like a professional bio than anything else.
Well, he was a very distinguished
and-
diplomat, even though he had been purged. Like he went on to do a whole bunch of great academia and stuff like that. So he would have been worthy of receiving this. It's just the fact that like this, the state said goodbye, and then the head of state said, "Here's this award." So there is this sort of historical kind of giant question mark over this guy. And you guys have an empty file folder, so now it sounds like this is a true crime podcast.
But it's not. I'll say it's not empty, but appointments to the Order of Canada, they're decided and made by an advisory committee, and that the file that we pulled doesn't contain any record of what could have been discussed at the committee at the time. We don't have that in the file.
But do you at least have like the letter? Because somebody's got to write like fill in the form to apply for this thing for Mr. Holmes. Is that paper not even there with the name that says, "Dear Governor General, please give us this person the award," signed cordially. What's the person's name? What's the name?
We wouldn't be able to release that information, but I actually didn't see it.
If the name is there, is there a way I could like do a formal appeal to the Governor General, sort of like in honor of reconciliation on this file? Could you, for this one in time only in history, tell us who this person was? Because honestly, if it's just some nobody I don't care about, like it's not a big deal. But if it was someone like, historically significant, like, a member of cabinet or somebody who's like feeling bad about having seen what happened,
Absolutely.
Like that would be interesting and that should be included. So
I will have to look into that, but I will say I looked at the file and I didn't see it. But there's a few reasons why that might have been. What I can do is look into what you can do. What
do you think some of those
may be.
reasons could be? Since just sort of in terms of like wrapping up the mystery to this cute story now, because
I don't think it's some big conspiracy or anything.
I also am not thinking conspiracy. I'm thinking old paperwork and it fell out of a file and it's old from the 60s.
Kind of. So I will say a lot of what I did see was kind of obviously it had been scanned, but it was handwritten. And what we suspect is that there may have been more information, but it might have been discarded. And I can't give you a reason necessarily for that, but that's what we suspect.
I'm just going to chalk it up to really bad administration of the GG.
It's with the Library and Archives Canada.
Oh, it's over there. Okay, this wasn't even like something you dusted off in your own basement. You had to go over to the archives for this. So
we had to go. That's part of the reason why it took so long. The file I received, there was no reference to significance of his date of appointment, to the purge, to any information of that nature. There was absolutely no reference.
Okay, I'm not saying there's a conspiracy. Just because I'm saying there might not have been conspiracy doesn't mean there isn't conspiracy.
To give you a bit of an idea, the file held kind of professional biographies notes more than anything else, I would probably say.
Right. Okay.
And there wasn't anything really of significance. Obviously, he's done great things. He had a really impressive bio, but there wasn't anything of significance related to kind of the angle you're
like
kind
the
of
reason why, like
from.
I just want to know who put his name in. That's all. But if it's not there, it's not
there. It is
there.
a mystery.
Speaking of mysteries, now would be a good time to give thanks to the folks who helped uncover the mysteries of the LGBT Purge, including journalist Dean Beebe, who told you the story of John Watkins in episode 2 of this series, academics Lynn Golliker and Carmen Poulain, who conducted interviews with Purge survivors over many decades, academic and activist Gary Kinsman, and of course, Patrizia Gentili.
It was a labor of love, and I think that's why when I see that we're still having the same problems that we haven't really learned from these lessons, it's really difficult for me.
Well, you and Gary, I'm not going to call you a hero, but you did a hell of a lot of work. It's not like anybody else was doing this heavy lifting to try and track down this history.
Yeah, and you mentioned Dean Beebe, right? I think, I really want to tip my hat to that incredible journalist. And this is why journalists are so important in our society, in all democratic societies. It's because Dean Beebe asked the question. He asked the really difficult questions, and he went to the archives and he found the documents. The first 40 pages of documents around the security purge were accessed by Dean Beebe. And then he wrote about it in newspapers as a featured story or sort of like an article. And if it wasn't for his work, I know that I personally would not have done this research. So if anything comes out of this research and this whole experience around the anti-queer purge campaign, Sean, I hope it's one of the greatest acts of resistance we can have is to always ask the hard questions, to be critical, to be vigilant in our questions, right? Which is what Dean Beebe did as a journalist, right? Look, that's an incredible journalist, I think.
Journalistically, it would be remiss of me not to mention that Canada has had at least one openly queer Minister of National Defence. That happened in 2004 when Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin appointed Bill Graham to the post. Bill Graham died in 2022. After reading the many tributes that paid respect to Bill Graham's wife of 60 years and his adult children, his longtime friend, Canadian philanthropist, arts patron, and entrepreneur Salah Bashir was compelled to write an online opinion piece about Bill. Quote, "The memorials, including some from within the gay community, scandalously fail to mention his other partner of the last 20 years, a mutual friend who recently sent me a video link to the funeral, which he will have to watch from home as he was not invited. Are we not yet past the stigma of recognizing bisexuality and fluid sexual orientation as a reality of the human condition?" Unquote. "This is not to out or judge anyone," wrote Bashir. "I say this out of admiration and love, knowing the totality of the man. His breadth of sexuality does not in any way lessen his relationship with his wife and family. It is not my business to know what arrangements people come to, but I admire the courage, respect, and self-knowledge it takes to make them."
My name is Captain Scott Nanis. I'm a pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force. I fly the Bombardier Challenger, and my drag name is Anne Moi, so I think it's the intersection of those two parts of what I do that is why you want to speak with me.
We started this series with the surprising realization that drag performances are a Canadian military tradition that dates back to the First World War. As you heard in episode 1 of this series, drag boosted morale and helped ease the tensions of war. I was pleasantly surprised to connect with Captain Nanis, who happens to fly the Prime Minister around, and I was curious to know how accepting he finds today's military.
In the last few years, as there have been more pushes to make it a more equitable workspace, certainly we are familiar with a few of the reports that have come out over the last few years about the culture of the military. There has been a lot of effort to make it a more inclusive workspace, and I think that in the way that I probably got by earlier in my career by being under the radar or just being straight passing, that's not something that is necessary in today's context.
Let's talk about drag. When does drag sort of become your side gig?
Honestly, relatively recently. This has only been in the last year that this has kind of started as a side project. I was a big fan of drag, like, a lot of people are. RuPaul's Drag Race was I'd been to, like, a few drag shows before. That was kind of my entry point into mainstream drag. And, without necessarily making this a therapy session, I was going through a divorce, and a lot of things in my life were changing. I was looking for a creative outlet for a lot of the stuff that I was working through, and drag provided me that outlet.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Do folks at your day job know what you do?
Absolutely. And this is something that when I first started telling people, it was kind of like they were excited for me and they had questions. And then at the end, they'd be like, "Oh, don't worry. Like, I'm not going to tell anyone else." And I'm like, this is an art form that thrives on word of mouth. Like, tell whoever you want. Like, this is not a dirty little secret. This is not something I'm trying to keep quiet. Like, tell whoever you want. And I've had multiple coworkers that have actually shown up to some of my shows. So it's certainly something that everyone I work with am aware of, and I've had the support of some people actually coming out to watch.
If there have been any negative opinions about his drag persona, Scott said he hasn't heard of any.
You know, in a large way, I am the benefactor of people that didn't come all that long before me. Like you say, it was only 1992 that the policy changed. And I listened to the episode in season 1 that you did with Michelle Douglas, and I absolutely... I loved listening to that interview, and it kind of reminded me that, like, I see Michelle Douglas as a historical figure, but then realizing, like, she's still around. She's still, like, so you're right that this is not that long ago in her history, and it's because of the work that she did, that other people did to change the military policy, that it was not a fight that I had to go through. It wasn't even really that hard of a decision for me to try and decide, do I want to be in the military or do I want to be a drag queen? That those are two things that can exist at the same time. So I'm lucky in that respect, but it didn't just happen. And I'm sure your podcast is going to explore many of the people that did allow that to happen.
I am grateful for everyone who agreed to speak with me for this documentary series, especially the many survivors. They were open and vulnerable in ways that I hope will teach Canadians about this dark past and make them take notice when attempts are made to slide backwards. Something that's going to be hard to miss is the 2S LGBTQI National Monument in Ottawa, known as Thunderhead. On May 1st, 2024, about 200 people gathered for an afternoon groundbreaking ceremony under a warm, mostly sunny sky. First Nations elders were in attendance, Heritage Minister Pascal Saint-Onge said a few words, and of course, LGBT Purge Fund Executive Director Michelle Douglas and Board Chair Martine Roy.
When you've been pursuing justice and reconciliation for a long time, sometimes you just expect the fight to go on forever. And maybe it does. But today, I'm stopping to appreciate how far we've come. How could I not, when you incredible people are gathered here, standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder together? Feeling hope in the midst of hardship is essential. This monument is a project at the heart of the LGBT Purge Fund.
Michelle told the assembled crowd that the budget for the monument is about $13 million.
The money specifically paying for the monument would have gone to victims of the LGBT purge had they lived to make a claim in the class action lawsuit. In this way, the monument is a gift from those who never received justice. Thunderhead is being built with this money. Some of us call it blood money. The legacy of these victims will always remain at this site. We will never forget them.
I just want to say it's been a long way. It's since I didn't want to come back to Ottawa after I was purged in 1984. I came back in 2014 for the first time. And for me, that we're doing a monument, it means a lot. And that we made it there, but we don't do it alone. It takes a village. It takes everybody to do it. And that's what's really important to understand here, is all the community from Quebec to all Canada, please, we need to gather and fight together. I think it's the best way that we would resolve this. So, thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Construction of the Thunderhead Monument is expected to be complete in time for Ottawa's Capital Pride in 2025. This particular story brings you as far as I can take you in the LGBT Purge saga, at least for now. There are still many unanswered questions and stories to share, and thankfully, there are thousands of pages of more government documents being released in 2025. If you've enjoyed this series, please give us a 5-star rating or a great review wherever you're listening to us right now. And thank you for listening. Queer Legends, The Truth of Canada's LGBT Purge is a production of Secret Agents and was supported in part by a community grant from the LGBT Purge Fund. This episode was researched, written, recorded, and technically produced by Sean Dern. The executive producer is Ian Capstick. Find Queer Legends on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, YouTube, and everywhere else you go for great storytelling.